Tom Scott ran the biggest company in America, and it was bleeding to death. He ran the Pennsylvania Railroad, the largest private company in the United States, more miles of track than most countries had roads. But it was 1877, and the money was gone. 4 years earlier, in 1873, a massive financial crisis had hit the entire country. Banks had failed, businesses had closed, millions of people had lost their jobs. It was the worst economic disaster that America had seen up until that point. The Pennsylvania Railroad had already cut worker wages once in 1873, and by June of 1877, it posted its second straight year of heavy losses. Scott's board was demanding more cuts immediately, or the company could not meet its debt payments. He had one variable left he could still touch: what he paid his workers. The 1873 panic and its 4-year depression are well documented. The Pennsylvania Railroad's 1877 wage cut, a 10% reduction, the second in 4 years, is confirmed in primary sources including congressional testimony from the period. So Scott made the call. Starting July 1st, every railroad worker would take a 10% pay cut. These were people already living on the edge. Dangerous work, really long hours, small pay, and now less of that pay. So a boardroom in Philadelphia could survive a crisis whose workers had no part in creating. But here's what Scott didn't plan for. His workers had been watching him lose a war for 4 years, and they had figured out exactly who started it. How does a fight between two rich men over shipping rates end with people dying in the street? To understand that, you have to go back to John D. Rockefeller. In the 1870s, oil was the most important product in America. Everyone needed it. Kerosene lit every single home. And oil only moves one way back then, by train. Scott's trains. Rockefeller had the oil, Scott had the tracks. They needed each other. But Rockefeller found a way to tilt the game in his favor. He went to the railroads with a deal. Give me a secret discount on every barrel I ship, and I'll send you more volume than you've ever seen. Scott said no. He called it unfair to smaller businesses, and he was right. Other railroads, though, said yes. That one difference, Scott's refusal, everyone else's agreement, set off a chain of events that would end with an American city in flames. He called it unfair to smaller businesses, and he was right. Other railroads, though, said yes. That one difference, Scott's refusal, everyone else's agreement, set off a chain of events that would end with an American city in flames. You're probably predicting it goes like this. Rockefeller wins on price, Scott loses custom. Once Rockefeller had his secret discounts from the other railroads, he moved super fast. He dropped his kerosene prices lower than any competitor could match. One by one, smaller oil companies went broke. Rockefeller bought their ruins for cheap. When Scott saw what was happening, he fought back. He started building his own oil pipelines, his own refineries. He was going to cut Rockefeller out completely. Rockefeller's response was cold and precise. He canceled every shipping contract Standard Oil had with the Pennsylvania Railroad. All at once, no warning. He pushed other railroads to lower their rates so Scott's trains looked expensive by comparison. Customers left, revenue collapsed, and Scott was stuck. Too deep in debt to fight, too proud to quit. So he did the only thing left. He cut his workers' wages and hoped the bleeding would stop. Now here's what almost everyone assumes happens next. The workers got angry, they walked off the job, Scott sent in troops, the troops fired, people died, Scott lost anyway, simple, tragic, the end. Except, Scott didn't just react to the riot. He saw it coming and he tried to use it. Scott wanted the strike. He actually needed it, and it was his last move. Scott had lobbied Congress for federal authority to deploy troops to protect railroad property during labor disputes. This is documented in his congressional testimony. He publicly called for federal intervention once the strikes began, and historians including David O. Stoll and others note that railroad executives viewed labor unrest as an opportunity to break the unions permanently and establish federal protection as a precedent. Tom Scott had spent years in Washington asking for one thing, a law that would let the president send federal troops to protect railroad property if workers ever went on strike. He knew a wage cut would cause a walkout. He had done it before in 1873. He knew what workers would do. His plan was this: cut the wages, let the strike begin, let it get loud enough to justify calling in the federal government, then crush it once and for all. Workers go back to work at lower pay, unions are broken, the railroad survives. He even chose who to send into Pittsburgh carefully. Not local Pennsylvania soldiers, men who knew the workers, who had neighbors on the picket line. He sent militia from Philadelphia. Strangers, men with no reason to hesitate. The first part worked exactly as planned. Workers walked out. Local soldiers refused to fire on their neighbors. The strike spread. Scott called in the Philadelphia militia, and when the crowds threw rocks, they fired live ammunition into it. 20 people died in minutes. That's where the plan stopped working. Scott had calculated a manageable strike. He got something the country had never seen before. Tens of thousands of people. Tens of thousands of people. Not just railroad workers, but factory workers, shop workers, anyone who had ever felt squeezed by a boss they couldn't fight, poured into the streets of Pittsburgh. They burned 500 freight cars, over 100 locomotives, entire rail yards gone overnight. The federal troops Scott had been lobbying for finally came. They came to a city already in ashes. There was nothing left to protect. He had lit the match himself. The fire just wouldn't stop where he told it to. Rockefeller never threw a single punch. He just waited. When Pittsburgh burned, John D. Rockefeller was doing nothing. That was his whole strategy. He hadn't sent in troops. He hadn't cut anyone's wages. He had just turned off the money, one canceled contract at a time, and waited for Scott to panic. Scott panicked, exactly the way Rockefeller needed him to. When the smoke cleared, Scott had no property, no cash, and no leverage. He went to Rockefeller and gave up. Rockefeller offered him just enough business to keep the railroad alive, but the terms were total. Secret shipping discounts, inside information on every competitor using Scott's tracks, a cut of every barrel his rivals shipped. Rockefeller now had invisible control over the entire American rail system. He didn't own it. He just owned the man who did. More than 100 workers died. Their families received nothing from the settlement, not a single dollar. They were the fuel for someone else's war. Tom Scott had a stroke the following year. He died at 57. His empire hollowed out. Rockefeller lived to 97. Rockefeller had won everything, except he left a paper trail. By 1880, Rockefeller controlled more than 90% of American oil. The railroads answered to him. Most politicians owed him favors. The press was scared of him. But somewhere inside Standard Oil's own offices, every secret deal had been written down. Every rate agreement, every contract that had slowly strangled Scott and the dozens of other businesses, all of it on paper. And a journalist named Ida Tarbell was about to find it. Tarbell wasn't a union organizer or a politician. She was a woman from Western Pennsylvania whose father's small oil business had been quietly destroyed by Rockefeller's discount scheme, one of thousands of casualties nobody ever counted or named. She spent 5 years reading every document she could find, every deal, every secret railroad agreement. What she uncovered didn't just expose one man, it broke up the most powerful company in American history and changed the rules of capitalism for the next 100 years. That story is next. I tell this story because these moves are still happening. Right now, there are industries where a small number of companies control so much, the platforms, the shipping, the payment systems, that anyone trying to compete gets quietly cut off the same way Scott was. Not with fire, with contracts, with pricing, with slow removal of access until the other person breaks. Understanding how Rockefeller did this in 1877 is the closest thing I found to a real map of how concentrated power works, how it moves, where it's weak, and what happens to regular people caught in the middle when two powerful men decide to fight. The workers in Pittsburgh didn't start this war. They just happened to be standing between the two men who did. That part hasn't changed. And if you're wanting to go deeper on this, I've linked to some resources below so you can read more and find out more about how this has happened and how it's happening today. Stay tuned. We'll catch you in the next video.